Welcome to the TechCast Webinar Series titled Foresight in Turbulent Times Tools for Managing Change and Risk. My name is Flynn Busey, and I'm co-hosting this series with Lamore Schaffman, and we're glad you joined us today. Certainly, it's not difficult to look around and see that we live in turbulent times. What that means is that the changes that are occurring faster and with greater interdependence. And forecasting and futuring skills are increasingly important during this time. We launched this series to allow the opportunity for top futurists and forecasters and strategies to address some of those big issues that are affecting our world, and to help bring the focus of today to include tomorrow. Our first three organizations that will be a part of this series are TechCast, SciCast, and the Millennium Project. We'll talk more about SciCast and Millennium Project at the end of this particular webinar, but today we're going to hear from TechCast. And to introduce and host today's show, let me ask Lamore Schaffman to introduce the program.
Flynn, thank you so much. And it's a pleasure being with all of you here. Thank you so much for your patience as we uncover and learn this technology that we're dealing with. It's always fun to do these live shows and see what goes on when they happen. So it's wonderful to be with you all as we're kicking off our first of this series. And before we begin, it looks like most of you have discovered where the questions box is. Thank you so much for putting in your comments already, and please continue to do so. As we go through the program, I'm going to be keeping an eye on the questions and comments that you put in and try to bring them into the conversation as much as possible, because we want this to be as interactive as possible. To start this off, today's webinar is a discussion about the age of consciousness and how technology is driving the world beyond knowledge. Joining us today is Professor William Halal. He's professor at George Washington University. And he's also president of TechCast Global, and he co-founded the Institute for Knowledge and Innovation and is a Mitchell Prize winner. Owen Davies is TechCast's executive editor. He's a longtime writer and editor specializing in science and technologies, and for the past 30 years he's worked on forecasting, and that being his focus. So gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. Bill, why don't you kick us off and tell us a little bit about the topic we're talking about, and also what you see as the overview of what you're going to be presenting.
Well, we thank you, Lamore and Flynn, for hosting this this webinar series. You're doing a great job, and you make us look so civilized. So we're very grateful. I have been fascinated by the technology revolution ever since I was an aerospace engineer on the Apollo program many years ago. Today, we want to give you my best thinking on our latest work, which is, as you can see, consciousness. But before we get into that, I'd like to let Owen Davies, our executive editor, say a few words. Owen knows our forecast better than anybody else in the world. So, Owen, please tell people about yourself.
Hi, Bill. Thanks very much. Thanks, Lamore. As Lamore said, I've been a writer and editor roughly as long as there's been movable type. In the early 1980s, I was a staff editor at Omni magazine, and one day our book editor introduced me to Dr. Marvin Cetron at Forecasting International, one of the absolute best practitioners of forecasting. I was supposed to help him write a book, and that first project turned into a 30-year apprenticeship in forecasting, which continues to this day. I got to know Bill and TechCast maybe 10 years ago and was just enormously impressed by their unique brand of forecasting. We'll talk a little bit later about how it works, but enough for now to say that it's just enormously effective and accurate. So when the opportunity came to join them, I jumped at it, and here we are now. Bill?
Great, thank you, Owen. Now, what we want to do is put this series in a historic context. We want to address questions like, where are we going, and how are we going to get there? And I hope this context, this broad framework, is going to be useful for the following webinars in this series so that other speakers can draw on it. To do that, we're going to use an evolutionary perspective, and it's going to show us, I think, how technology is driving the world beyond knowledge to consciousness. It's just a powerful force that is beyond any of us. We can't stop it, and I'm going to show you how this is likely to happen. There are lots of definitions of consciousness. Let's clear that up first of all. For our purpose here, we're going to define it very simply as everything beyond knowledge. I think that's a fairly precise definition. It includes things like values, beliefs, ideologies, strategic choices, all of those things that are really an ordinary part of life, but we take for granted because they're like the air. We just assume that they're there. We don't give much attention. But those things we think are going to come to the fore. The new age of consciousness, which we think is emerging right now, we think it's here right now, is kind of like the information age 40 years ago, if you remember when that started. There was enormous mystery about that. Nobody understood what the age of consciousness was really going to be like. And that's where we are today. It's a new frontier. It has promises and perils, and we're trying to figure them out. Now, Owen has some thoughts about clarifying the issue of consciousness. Owen, please tell us what you're thinking.
Thanks, Bill. As you know, I've been focused on this quite a lot lately. The more I look at it, the more I keep coming back to the word leadership. Consciousness is all those things that make someone a leader instead of just an expert. It's also the things that leaders appeal to in others to recruit people to their cause. As you say, ideas, values, motivation, pretty much anything that isn't straight facts and figures and learned procedures. Lately, there's an element of technology as well. When the American women's movement, for example, was getting organized in the 60s and 70s. Big ideas were communicated through books. It took years to get them across, and organizing a major public activity such as a protest could take months. Now skip ahead to the Tea Party movement. It didn't exist at all until December 2007. By 2009, it was already endorsing political candidates. 5 years after that, 10% of American voters identify themselves as members. The Tea Party is largely a creation of the Internet. That's where it spread its ideas and organized many of its activities. We see the same thing in other countries. Protesters during the Arab Spring operated mostly by cell phone, with text messages and Internet access. In just a few months, they were changing policies and even toppling governments. So that's how I see consciousness, all our mental equipment that is not pure knowledge, organized and amplified by technology. Unfortunately, there's a downside to that. Technology also lets us filter our information to an extent that hasn't been possible before. In a time when we need broad cooperation to solve our problems, none of us ever has to listen to anyone we don't already agree with. I think that one fact, as much as anything else, is responsible for the polarization and extremism we see in the world today. Bill, over to you.
Thank you. Well, you're exactly right, Owen. You can see the rise of consciousness even now. And it's not always pretty. That's one of the key things about consciousness. It's not equated with goodness. It includes everything beyond knowledge, good things, bad things. Now, we think understanding this abstract topic of consciousness is really critical for leaders in business and government. Because it's going to dominate society, we think, in years to come. It should dominate now, but it's not. We've always used knowledge, but the information age simply made knowledge more powerful, and it dominated the entire social order because everybody, or most of the labor force, worked in knowledge industries. The same thing we think is going to happen with consciousness. It's always been around, but now it's reached the point where it is the next great frontier. It's the next great challenge. We have to tame it, so to speak, to address these big issues of our time. And to do that, we're probably going to make this much more elaborate as a body of knowledge, as a body of practice. And I think it's probably going to dominate society. So that's why this is important. And we're going to talk more about that in our last slide. You can see the 4 slides we're going to touch on here. We're going to talk about that more extensively beyond knowledge, and we're going to see that what we need, what we're moving towards, I think, is a new paradigm or a vision for a high-tech global order that is based on common purpose, that unifies all of these different elements of the world today into a functioning global order. That's a big challenge, but we think that is the next step in evolution. And it has to be based on common purpose, restructuring of business and government, using the power of collaboration, and developing a sense of global citizenship and ethics. We only have 4 slides, so we have, I think, lots of time to talk. And after each one, Owen and I are going to take questions and comments from the audience. Just keep entering them in the chat box, and Lamore and Flynn will bring them to our attention. Now, do we have any comments and questions at this point?
Bill and Owen, we thank you for that introduction. You've raised a number of questions, and we're looking forward to your getting to those issues as we move through the rest of the slides. Let me remind everybody that you can enter your questions, and we will be including those along the way. Let's go to the first slide.
Okay. Now, the next slide here is one I just love, the life cycle of evolution. This is the big picture for humanity. I'm very proud of this slide because I've worked on it for many, many years. And the thing I like about it is that it's a real graph with real data points, empirical data. You see a lot of sketches like this, but they're not really graphs. They're not the scale or anything. It has real scales. And the key to making this work is the log scale at the bottom, because the time differences horizontally are enormous. At the left, we have billions of years. In the middle, millions. Then we go to thousands, and then decades. So how do you compress these enormous time differences into a usable image? And I think the log scale is what does that. And what we see when we do that is that life on the planet has taken a great S-curve, taken the form of a great S-curve. S-curves are symbolic of all life processes. A culture of bacteria or a person growing up will follow an S-curve throughout their life. So it's just a remarkable universal symbol of growth and development, and this is for the planet. It reminds me of the theory proposed about 20 or 30 years ago by the famous biologist James Lovelock, who talked about Gaia. Gaia was the great organism that we're creating, life on the planet, and now that has a life of its own, and it's self-correcting and all that sort of thing. Some people think Gaia is a little speculative, but science has embraced it, I think. There are a number of different formulations of that theory. In fact, the S-curve is so ubiquitous that we included it in our logo. In the left here, you can see that I've just slapped in our logo, and you can see the S-curve here, because technology forecasts follow a life cycle that is an S-curve. And so we use S-curves throughout the site. Now, the key point about this life cycle is that it has now reached a phase in which we're calling the crisis of maturity. Every one of these phases ends with a great crisis that is resolved by a new technology. And that's what we're doing today. The crisis of maturity is upon us. I call it more specifically, it's a global mega crisis. We'll talk about that in just a minute. And it's rather like a team, like the life of a team. We've reached the point of complete physical development. We can do almost anything physically. We have all this wonderful knowledge, but we can't solve the problems of our time. And so that requires something different, a higher level of sophistication, which is what a teen is struggling with to reach adulthood. So this is, I think, a very powerful insight to see that life on the planet is evolving through its own life cycle, and it's now reached a critical point that I think is going to usher in a new phase of development. Now, Owen, why don't you tell us a little bit about S-curves? You have some thoughts about that.
A few, yeah. As Bill says, we see them everywhere in science and nature. If you look at the growth of a bacterial culture or the number of living baby boomers, what you find is an S-curve. You even see it in the development of companies and markets. You get us off to a slow start, then there's a period of fast growth, and finally a leveling off. The fact that this chart comes out as an S-curve, that it fits such a common pattern, gives me a lot of confidence in it. This looks like a good way to view the evolution of our world. It just makes sense. And it does imply that sometime in the future we'll enter a period when life becomes much more stable. We won't stop learning any more than we gave up farming when we outgrew the age of agriculture. But the thing that drives our next transformation won't be the accumulation of knowledge. That is now business as usual. The next change will be figuring out how to harness all those things that aren't knowledge, learning how to govern ourselves in ways that can sustain us and the planet in the long term. Call it the age of consciousness. It's certainly as good a description as any I've heard for it. Bill?
Yeah, thanks, Owen. Now, the thing we wanted, one last point we want to make before we move on, is that what is the justification for thinking that consciousness is the next phase in evolution? Well, I think there are a couple of reasons that we'll clarify in this talk. But the first, the most obvious one, is just logically indicated by the progression, the logical progression of these various stages. We are at knowledge now. We've known that for 20 or 30 years. And by definition, everything beyond knowledge is consciousness. But the more compelling reason, I think, is that the global mega crisis is so enormous that we can't resolve it with the present mode of consciousness that we now commonly share, that was based upon an industrial era of 20 or 100 years ago. That's not going to do it. And we're going to show in the next slide how the mega crisis is just fraught with all of these subjective problems, like global deniers and the lack of political will to do things, or terrorism itself. These are problems that require something much different, and that's where the attention, I think, has to be, and that's why we're, I think, moving towards this age of consciousness right now. Now, that's the conclusion of our discussion of this slide. Do we have any comments and questions on this? Please tell us what you're thinking. We'd like to know what's going on in your mind so we can have a dialogue with you.
Wonderful. So, Bill and Owen, we do have a couple of questions that have come in. And they're both regarding the S-curve. One of the comments is that most of the curves go on to decline, not stability. So if you could address that. And then we have another question that asks, S-curves are ubiquitous, but this chart could be a straight line if you change the arbitrary vertical scale. What other reasons do we have for thinking it will be slow now rather than 100 or 1,000 years from now? So if you could both address those.
Okay, good. Those are great questions. The first one is, what happens after saturation? I hope I have that question correct. That's true. Most life processes saturate. But after, I don't want to get into the really far out things because that's another topic, but after a global order is reached in the next 20, 30, 50 years, I think the next big stage is deep space exploration. And that's another whole life cycle. That's a completely different life cycle. Scientists talk about a type 1 civilization where the planet becomes unified into a coherent whole, and that would complete the life cycle on this planet, but then we would initiate similar life cycles perhaps in other planets. But we don't really know. That's speculative. Now, the second question that I heard was, remind me again, what was the second question?
Sure. So the second question is, S-curves are ubiquitous, but this chart could be a straight line if you change the arbitrary vertical scale. What other reasons do we have for thinking that it will slow down now rather than 100 or 1,000 years from now?
Well, I don't think this would be a straight line if you were to use a different. It does depend on the vertical scale, no question about it. But if you were to use it as a vertical scale, population growth, global GDP, energy use, almost anything, you would see an S-curve. I'm confident of that. So I don't think that's a problem. Go ahead.
Sorry, I just wanted to get to the other part of that. When you look at the curve here, why does it start to level off sometime in the relatively near future? Why not 10,000 years from now? Well, the problem is that we have so many problems at the moment that resist solution by pure knowledge, and we'll talk about that a little more in a minute, that the pressure is on now to solve things, to take care of global warming and terrorism and all the other issues we face. And that pressure is what eventually forces us to develop some sort of stable mechanism of life for the planet and continue on in a relatively stable sort of way. That's, again, not to say that we're about to stop learning new things about biomedicine and nanotechnology and whatever else comes along. But we simply don't have any choice but to evolve some method of life that doesn't involve constant raping of the planet for new resources and filling the environment with all sorts of pollution and uncontrolled population growth and all the other problems that we face now. Things straighten out, things level off in the future, the relatively near future, just because we really don't have any choice. We can't put it off for 10,000 years or even 1,000. Bill?
I think that's exactly right. This process is beyond humans. This is much greater than humans. It's a planetary process. The planet it seems to have a life of its own in a way, and it's going through this process very quickly. Now, any more comments or questions? I think we should move on.
Yeah, we do actually have several more. I just want to address everyone who's writing in. Thank you so much for your comments and questions. We're going to continue, and I'm going to come back to these comments and questions that you've written as much as possible over the course. So we are going to continue with the presentation. Bill?
Okay. Here we are. Now, here is the global mega crisis. We're going to talk about this a bit. This is something that Michael Marion, a very well-known futurist and bibliographer, and I have worked on for many years. You can see the publications that we've produced at the bottom. And there's a lot of work here. I can just sum it up very briefly. We do two things. We have been conducting trend analysis, where we look at all the trends driving the mega crisis, trends that are opposing it, resolving it. And we find, and the thing that stands out is we see about twice as many trends that are causing this than are resolving it. The ones that are causing it are pretty obvious. We hear about them all the time: climate change and energy and all of that. There's another 5 or 10 more. But I must say this is a work in progress. We're constantly adding to this and updating the trends. And then the trends that are resolving it are, some are self-evident, like alternative energy is going to eventually solve the problem of climate change. And then saturation, people can only consume so much, so at some point our needs are going to saturate. And then we have much better knowledge available now, so we understand things. And women and young people tend to be progressive, and they're taking a more active role. Young people in particular, I think, they're going to have to resolve this problem. And then finally, there's a long-term trend in which we have solved these problems throughout history, which is another way of talking about the S-curve. Now, we also do a survey to gauge the level of optimism and pessimism that people have about this. And the results vary a little bit depending upon the precise questions we're asking. But we find that roughly 60 to 70% probability of either a major catastrophe in which we lose civilization in parts of the world, or big disasters like a nuclear exchange or collapse of major ecosystems and so forth. That's pretty grim. And only a 30 to 40% probability of muddling through this. Now, I talk to ordinary people when I lecture on this, and they all intuitively understand this. This view, I think, is widely held. The problem, of course, which we've also learned from these studies, is that people see a lack of leadership, lack of political will. There's no vision as to where we're going, and we can't seem to cooperate. All of that kind of thing. These are things, again, beyond knowledge. And it's going to take, I think, a new global consciousness that to see us through this. Any comments or questions about the global mega crisis?
Yeah, as Bill says, there's nothing really new about any of the individual trends here. We see stories of climate change and energy and terrorism in the news every day, though TechCast Global can probably offer some unique insights into their nature and meaning. But for our purposes, for when you think about a mega crisis, what's important is that all these things are happening at the same time. Climate change alone would be an enormous challenge to us. Globalization would be an enormous challenge. Terrorism, an enormous challenge. Growing shortages of water, an enormous challenge. But they aren't just one crisis at a time. They're this confluence of a bunch of them, a mega crisis, as we call it. And what's important is recognizing the other thing, that none of them can be solved by knowledge alone. We don't know everything there is to know about climate change or terrorism, but we know enough. We know enough to begin to deal with them. And yet the problems aren't getting solved. They involve concepts and values that we often cling to even more tightly when evidence proves them wrong. Look at climate change deniers for one example. That's just being human. It's, in a rational world, we wouldn't have terrorism. We'd already be dealing effectively with climate change. But it's just not happening, and that has to do with not knowledge or reason, but everything to do with values and awareness, what we call consciousness. And as Bill says, throw in leadership as well. It's hard to find these days, and we won't solve any of the world's big problems without it.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Alan. Thank you very much. Any comments or questions?
Yes, we have a few coming in. So when you look at the survey results, have the survey results changed over time?
They have a little bit, but it's very minor. These attitudes seem to be stable. The world seems to be stuck in this holding pattern where we're really kind of waiting for events to drive things rather than taking the initiative.
It's hard to see people being very optimistic unless we're actually doing something to solve our problems.
Yeah. There is some movement. I was impressed by the fact that Obama and the leader of China made an agreement to do something about climate change, and I think all of the nations of the world have, in principle, agreed to start limiting carbon emissions, but these are still vague and not very satisfying solutions.
Okay. So another question that we have here is, when you talk to the 1% who are not providing leadership for their positions of power, how do you see this playing out? You're talking about 1% who are not providing leadership from their positions of power. How do you see this playing out? Is there money going to just insulate them from further catastrophes?
Well, I guess that's the prevailing view, that the 1% can insulate themselves from these things, but how long can they do that? I don't think that's very viable, and I don't think we really know how this is going to be resolved. We can't know that, but we're trying to provide a better understanding of the basic issues here. That's the purpose of this webinar, to try and get us to address the issue and get some clarity. If we can get clarity, then I think pressure can be brought to bear on the people in positions of power.
So one of the comments we just received is that there is progress on challenges such as world hunger, but this gentleman is not sure that this is understood by most people. But I think there's also another question that this brings in, which came in beforehand, which I think is a lot on our minds given what we're seeing going around in the world today, and even what's been happening here in the United States, but specifically Baltimore. With this, it goes back to your previous slide, with this transition stages, will the transition stage be peaceful or after a military crisis? What do you anticipate?
Who knows? I think that depends on how events unfold and how bad it gets, how quickly. One of our forecasts is environmental demands. There are uprisings around the world by ordinary citizens who are unhappy with the encroachment of very serious environmental problems into their lives. And we could envision a revolt against the current policies that let these things go on. So it could be violent. It could be a radical protest. But it also could be resolved fairly smoothly, I would think, if we could find leadership and a good vision of where we're going. And that's the kind of thing we want to talk about and stress at the end of our presentation.
You know, unexpectedly, one of the most promising places in the world here, one of the things that gives me a little bit of optimism is China. We think of that as a very top-down country, a country that's very much driven by the party and by the hierarchy in Beijing and enforced by the Chinese military. And yet they have thousands of protests a year for issues involving the environment. They have protests when somebody wants to put in a new chemical plant next to where a whole bunch of people are living, a new dam, many things of that kind. And very often we see Beijing adjusting its plans to take account of the will of the people. So if it can happen there, I think the rest of the world may have a good chance to get through, to scrape by without anything disastrous happening, without a military confrontation. Yeah. For what it's worth.
Let's hope that that's the case. We do have other questions, but let's proceed to the next slide, and again, I'll continue to bring them in.
Yeah, I think we should move along. We can always ask more questions later. Now, this is our most likely scenario for the period 2020 to 2030. Comes from our TechCast work. We call it a macro forecast. We aggregate all of our forecasts for emerging technology, social trends, and wildcards into a complete forecast for the planet as a whole. And this is just a quick summary. But we're not going to go into any detail here. You could go to the site if you want to look further. But before I go into that, I want to let Owen talk about our research methodology.
Yeah, I mentioned earlier how much TechCast's forecasting process impressed me, and it's worth repeating. It really is one of the most effective systems ever devised. Like most other forecasters, TechCast's core staff constantly gathers data. We follow trends. We think about scenarios of what might happen in the future. We do all the usual forecaster type stuff, and I think we do it pretty well. But that always leaves a lot of room for uncertainty. No matter how good you are, you can always overlook or misunderstand something that will turn out to be important. There's no way around that. Even the best of us get things wrong. So that's where TechCast deals with things a little bit differently. We also have a review board of about 130 expert forecasters. And they have a broad variety of specialties and viewpoints. Whenever there's a topic comes up, we know somebody who can give us the background and a good sense of what's important in that. So whenever we make a forecast, the experts check it. They estimate how likely the forecast is to come to pass. They guess when it will occur, and once in a while they catch the rest of us in a mistake. It's their collective wisdom that keeps the organization on track, and that's a unique system of collective intelligence. That's what caught my attention when I first heard of TechCast. It's given TechCast Global a record of accurate predictions that nobody else in the world today can equal, and it remains a powerful tool for us.
Well, if I can just put a really sharp focus on the essence of what we do here. We gather the best information we can, which is really crucial, and that brings great clarity to the situation for every forecast. But there is always uncertainty, and the experts resolve the remaining uncertainty. That's what makes this such a good system. Now, let's talk a little bit about some of these. The bullets on the left are mainly our technology forecasts, and you can see what we're forecasting here. There are precise times when all of this is going to happen, but our experts collectively think that this will occur in this time period of 2020 to 2030. Powerful developments like mastery over life. That's going to be just a remarkable thing, but these are very tough challenges. It's going to take another 10, maybe 15 years to do those things. And then there are always threats. The bullet at the bottom is the result of our work in wildcards. And so these forecasts could be thrown off kilter by some of these big wildcards. That's always possible. And then on the right is where it gets really serious. Our social trends show that all of these higher order values are emerging as dominant issues in American society and around the world itself. Now, higher order does not imply anything like goodness, or it's not an arbitrary term. Psychologists use this term to describe things that are beyond the material needs of life, things that are beyond the rational, economic type of dimensions. So the world is changing. These higher order values are coming to the fore. And then the next bullet here, infinite knowledge and intelligence, is really pivotal. This is where the rubber hits the road. All of these information technologies, and especially the second generation information technologies, nanotechnology, biotech, optical computers, quantum computers, that is going to continue the progression of Moore's law, so that in about 10 years, no more than 20 years, we will in effect have all of the knowledge and memory and intelligence that we can handle. And the big development here is the automation of routine thought. These technologies are going to eliminate the routine thought that occupies so much of our life now, like the GPS navigation systems, which have made maps almost obsolete. And that's going to happen throughout all segments of the kind of work that occupies us. And that raises the question, what will we do when knowledge work disappears? This is going to shift us into a higher order frontier, a higher order domain of consciousness that we really don't understand very well. What are we going to do about all those lost jobs and about people who don't have the IQ or the education to handle most jobs? I don't think we really know the answer to that question, precisely because it is a frontier, and we can't understand frontiers before we get into them. But my guess is going to be that we're going to focus attention on the last bullet here, consciousness, and specifically addressing the global mega crisis. Creative business people have always known that problems are opportunities in disguise. And the global mega crisis, precisely because it is such an enormous problem, has enormous opportunities. For instance, the remediating the problem of climate change and alternative energy and pollution and that sort of thing, that is almost a $1 trillion industry now. And I think it could be a $10 to $20 trillion industry with lots of jobs and so forth. So I don't think this is going to be dismal. I think there are great opportunities here, and we just have to explore this frontier. Any comments or questions at this point?
Lamore, I see the chat box here is flashing with unanswered questions.
Yes, it is. Sorry, it was just getting them organized there. Yes, there are a couple of questions. So as we're looking at, okay, so you were just talking about global consciousness, and so I've seen a couple of times during the course of the questions that people are still trying to understand how you're seeing consciousness versus awareness. And there's a question around how are you differentiating between the two, and aren't we not talking simply about awareness, and is awareness really going to be solving some of the issues that we're talking about, or do we need something more?
That's a great question, and it speaks to the confusion over consciousness. Consciousness is very badly understood. Scientists have been trying to figure it out for the last 20 years, and with great attention. They can't figure it out. I'm thinking of consciousness not in any specific type of behavior, but as a domain, just as knowledge is a domain. And knowledge contains bad knowledge, good knowledge, trivial knowledge, important knowledge, all kinds of knowledge. Consciousness is the same way. It's this enormous domain, like a higher level of behavior. but it's a level of behavior that is all around us. We just take it for granted. Awareness is one part of consciousness. There are all kinds of things in consciousness. The consciousness you have when you go to sleep and you dream, spiritual experiences, even making a decision is a shift in consciousness. But this is a good segue into our next slide, because that's what we're going to address there, what we call technologies of consciousness.
Okay, then before we go to the next slide, let me add another element of this for you and Owen, so you can keep it in mind as you're going through the next slide. And the question is, so 70% chance of collapse and 30% chance of global consciousness. It's a question. Is that what you're anticipating happening going forward?
Well, if we have a collapse, it'll be a form of consciousness. It'll be a pretty bad form of consciousness. It'll be consciousness of failure and disaster. But we're hoping, we think that the world will make it through this because of the long-term trend, the S curve. And I think that's very likely. So I think it's very likely. But
yeah, let's note there that 60-40 or 70-30 estimate there wasn't TechCast's measure. That was what we're finding people think in polls. 70% of people are very pessimistic about the future, or 60%, and 30 to 40% are relatively optimistic. They're not saying that we're going to do anything remarkably effective and wonderful about the future or our problems. They're saying that one way or another we'll get through it and come out the other side. So that's not our forecast. That's just what we're finding other people believe. Our forecast is, I think, Bill, that we will find a way through this, and we probably will come out the other side a more capable and effective species because of the challenges we're facing and trying to solve now.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think we're likely to make it through this. But what we're seeing now is the trauma, the uncertainty, the fear that people have because they don't see a way through this. There isn't sufficient leadership and vision to show them how we're going to get through this.
Okay.
Let's move on
so
to
there's one.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, there's one more comment that I think, you know what? Okay, I'll hold it to the last slide, but there is a comment that's been offered that I want to present to you guys because I think it's worthy of reflection, and I would want to hear more from you. But let's take a look at the next slide.
Okay. Now, here's this is our attempt to map out this frontier of consciousness a bit, and we don't profess to have this accurate in any precise way. It's a new frontier. We're just trying to get a sense of what's going on here. And what we have a number of things we can tell you about. TechCast forecasts some high technologies that are going to change consciousness, like neurotech. We're introducing brain prostheses right now. Thought power, the brain-computer interface, which is a remarkable development. Don't have time to discuss that in great detail, virtual reality. And consciousness is a part of ordinary life. Here are things that we do every day just to kind of control our consciousness, which is to say to control ourselves. That's, I think, a big challenge for most thinking people. How do they keep themselves on a level track and function effectively? And we want to focus on the left side of the slide here, leadership slide, where we think the attention should be focused and where the remedial steps are to be taken. And I'm going to just say a few things about this, not a great deal, because the challenge here is for leaders to shape consciousness. Ordinary consciousness is chaotic. People think everything, they have all kinds of ideas, but to make a society function, that leaders have to bring order to that chaotic level of consciousness with visions and mottos and showing examples of behavior and so forth. And this is where the challenge is for leaders today. And it has to start with a vision. right now, I don't think there is a vision for how the world is going to look, what it should look like when we get through this. We just don't know. A lot of people say a lot of things about it, but there's certainly nothing that is commonly accepted as kind of the goals of where we're going, and that is what is foremost needed. You can't get somewhere if you don't know what it is, and that's the purpose, one purpose of this webinar, to try and give us a better clarity on where we think the world is going to go. Then let's talk a little bit about creativity. The people like Henry Ford, Steve Jobs, Elon Musk, these are powerful, these are heroes. The inspiration that they bring to what they have accomplished is just enormous. And this is, they shape consciousness by the very fact that they change the world in their products and services. And then institutional change. I think one of the biggest problems we have today is business and government were built for the last century. They do not function properly for the 21st century. They have to be revised. One thing that I think is crucial, we've done a lot of work on, is the emergence of what we call collaborative enterprise. Collaborative enterprise, where the corporation is no longer seen as simply a vehicle for making money for investors, but as a coalition of partnerships between its various stakeholders. Its investors, of course, but also the employees, the customers, suppliers, distributors, the public, and so forth. And since they're partners, they contribute to the success of the enterprise as a whole, and they share in the benefits of the enterprise as a whole. Now, this is a remarkably different perspective, I think. It's not social responsibility, because that's seen as philanthropy, just doing good. This is productive. If we could do this, it would create more value for investors. They would make more money, I think, and it would also serve the social needs of society as a whole. And I think that is absolutely essential, because the world is so complex, so fraught with all of these social problems, like the mega crisis, that focusing on money alone is clearly suboptimal. There is a leading edge of creative business people who have done this for years, but it's always been relegated to the margins. I think of, for instance, John Mackey at Whole Foods with his book, Conscious Capitalism. In fact, the title alone is very telling, because he's used the word conscious. See, it suggests we are moving into this domain of consciousness. And he's got it right. There are lots of other people too. And the challenge is to bring that leading edge into the mainstream, to make that the dominant form of business and so forth. And then collaboration. Collaboration is one of the most unused forces in society. Collaboration is productive. People share knowledge, they learn more, they produce results that are better than you could otherwise. And I offer Obama's soft power as a good example. The use of sanctions to bring Iran to the bargaining table, and the way he's opened diplomatic relations with Cuba and so forth. These things may not work, but I think they're good examples of the right directions. Now, Owen wants to talk a little bit about the last bullet, global citizens and ethics.
Yeah, this is another thing that points toward this new age of consciousness. Global citizenship. Traditionally, people have thought of themselves as citizens of a specific country, England, France, the United States, whatever. That's less true now than it used to be. For most of 2 generations, young people in Europe have considered themselves to be European more than French or Dutch or German. And one thing that we know about them is that these days, young people have a lot more common with their peers in other countries, even than with their own parents and grandparents. And we see that in studies of values and priorities throughout the world. 20-somethings here in the United States have very, very much in common with their peers in India or Germany or parts of Africa or China or Japan, wherever. and much more in their values and attitudes in common with each other than, again, with their own parents. One thing that we're seeing these days is that the 20-somethings are even less likely to see themselves as citizens of a country or a continent like Europe, but as citizens of the world. Their concept of belonging is spreading, and they take it for granted that they can go to some other country wherever they see opportunity and build a productive, satisfying life for themselves and become an integrated part into that society. They carry a passport from their native country. As the law stands, there isn't much choice. But they tend to be much more aware of what's going on in the rest of the world than previous generations were, and they're much more interested in what is good for the world at large, not just the country where they happen to have been born. So if we solve problems such as climate change or terrorism, it'll be thanks to that new and inclusive attitude toward the world. I think of its appearance among the young as one small piece of evidence that this age of consciousness may well be dawning. When we look at ethics, we see something very similar. For most of the last century, philosophers and religious thinkers have been trying to develop an ethical system that everyone can accept: Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, everyone. Recently, the Dalai Lama has been a leader in this work. And it turns out that common ethical ground isn't all that hard to find. Every society in the world restricts killing. Most offer some exceptions, hence the death penalty, but the basic restriction is universal. No one thinks stealing is a good idea. Rape is hardly ever condoned. Insurgents in some parts of the world use it as a tool of war and intimidation, but that alone places them well outside social norms. They are inherently pariahs because of that one misdeed. All societies discourage lying, again with exceptions. No one tells his wife, "Of course that dress makes you look fat," not if he values his own survival. But outside the needs of courtesy, people in every society expect that others will tell them what they really believe. As the age of consciousness continues to develop, we can expect to see the world coming together around these and other common principles, and that in itself will push the age of consciousness a step forward. Bill?
Yeah, well, and I think the growth of technology is fostering this very dramatically. We all share the same news today around the world, and when we have automatic language translation in just a few years, we'll be able to understand everybody else's media and air travel. I mean, the world really is functioning as a global community. It's just not a very effective global community. And the challenge is to make it a community that really does work. Now, this really concludes our formal presentation. We want to talk to you and get your comments and questions, of course. We have a little time. But I hope you find this concept, the age of consciousness, a useful perspective, because I think it's really it's crucial. We see the limits of knowledge pressing in. Knowledge is not enough. It's not going to solve these problems. Technology, economics, knowledge, money, even power and war are still going to be important at times. They will have to be used, no question about that. But now we understand, I think, out of necessity, that all of this is embedded in this big domain of consciousness, of subjectivity, that goes beyond facts and reason, and that's what governs life. That's where we make choices, and that's a big challenge. It's an enormous challenge. This is where the major attention has to be developed, and we have to develop a framework, some kind of a coherent framework for a high-tech global order based on heightened awareness of what's going on, understanding, collaboration, wisdom, and leadership. That's a tall order, but it's just like a teenager growing up. We either have to do this or decline. So that's the challenge. We thank you for your attention, and let's take any additional comments and questions.
Thank you, Bill and Owen, and we have quite a few here, so I'm trying to aggregate them a little bit. Clearly, there's a lot of concern about what's happening in the Middle East, in ISIS, but also here in the United States with Baltimore. So we have a question regarding the previous slide as well as this one. So where do you see ISIS and Baltimore on this page? And that was regarding the previous slide. And also there's a question of global citizens' consciousness versus political extremist Islamists. What comments do you have for that? What you're seeing transpiring now and what you anticipate happening in the future?
Great point. Great point. I see these very serious conflicts as growing pains. They are a manifestation of the world going through its life cycle and reaching a point where it is being integrated. And these former problems that have festered for decades and centuries are coming to the fore because of our heightened awareness. They're growing pains. They're the difficult things that are omnipresent. Every society has things like this, and we've got to work our way through them. And I think we will. The Baltimore problem, I think, will be resolved. I think it's called attention to the fairly brutal treatment of a lot of police departments, and I think that will be addressed. The ISIS problem and the whole Middle East, the Arabic world, is tough. I am of Arabic descent myself. I'm Lebanese, although I'm a Christian, and I was raised in this country. But the Arabic world is going through a terrible crisis of identity. They are in the process of trying to modify their traditions, their Islamic faith, so that it is compatible with the modern world. They're going to need a lot of help, and it may take 2 or 3 decades. But I think it's part of growing up and forming a global community. It has to be addressed. They need help.
I see ISIS and other phenomena like that as a transitional problem as well. Whenever you see periods of great change, there are people who reject it, who resist it. We find that here in the United States. But that reactionary impulse is something that eventually fades away. It basically has to, because the problems today are so profound, so transformational, that they don't have any choice. Either they fade away or they get ground down by problems that we should have solved.
Wonderful. So let me bring in very shortly, because we only have a few moments left, I want to offer this comment that was brought in as well as another question. So the comment is, technology can solve many problems. Sorry, just moved on me. And so let's not focus on the problems, but on possible solutions. It seems to me that for some of the problems, such as climate change, only a few possible solutions are seriously considered. Most of these proposed solutions are very expensive and actually add to other problems. So how are we being expansive enough in our review of what the options are, and creative enough, looking at this list on your left-hand side here, are we in fact employing these leadership qualities to the issues that are at hand in a way that is the most effective and efficient?
I understand. I'm not. That question seems to cover a lot of territory. Could we put a sharper focus on it?
Well, and actually, so what I'm going to do, because we have only 2 minutes, I'm actually going to just sort of leave it out there. It is very broad, but I think it's an interesting comment, so I'll just leave it out there. I want to bring forward another comment and question. We continue to deal with, well, a lot of these questions are dealing with what is also in this scenario, what about the social and political crises that will happen in developing countries and producers of raw materials where their products are replaced by new materials such as graphene and new biofuels, because this person believes that the commodity prices will go down, affecting the budgets of the developing countries, which are raw material exporters. The reduction of demand will produce firing and unemployment, which in turn will lead to the big masses of people pressing for their governments to solve these troubles, which will be diffused in countries like Arab and Latin America, like the Arab Spring revolutions. So, as we're moving through these technological evolutions, And I mean, is that necessarily going to bring about these large masses of people who are going to become increasingly disenfranchised in these developing countries, and as a result open the way for entities which are not that productive to step in and take over?
Again, Lamore, let me step in here. We're down to 1 minute, and we need to get to wrap up this session with a brief moment looking forward at the future sessions. So if we can go to the next slide.
Yep, there we go.
As it shows here, the next two programs in this series, the next one is May the 7th with Charles Twardy and Associates. They've been working on a SciCast project, which is a very sophisticated method for assessing complex problems. And then on June 18th, Jerry Glenn, the head of the Millennium Project, will be coming in and share with us a program on how to create a global collective intelligence about the future. And the Millennium Project is made up of a global node, a series of nodes around the globe of people putting their input into these kinds of questions and others that are pressing upon us.
Hate to interrupt, Flynn, but that sure sounds a whole lot like developing an age of consciousness to me.
Well, I think in a way it certainly is a part of the mechanism for gaining a new kind of global consciousness. So again, it's 1 o'clock. Let me thank you for your participation today, and we look forward to your joining us in the next sessions, May 7, again at 12 to 1, and on June 18th from 12 to 1, and we will be having additional sessions announced later. But thank you for joining us. Lamore, do you want to say the final word?
No, well, again, I'm just going to reiterate what you said, Flynn. Thank you all for all your questions, your comments. Bill and Owen, thank you so much for what you've presented here today. I hope this left for lots of food for thought, and we can look forward to continuing the conversation with you all.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
All right.